Hola amigos, bienvenidos no, bienvenidos a una sesión de Donors Tag de .NET API Review. Yeah, that was probably all Spanish. I didn't think any of that was German. Uh, right, we're having a session today because we have a whole lot of red, and we're figuring out how much of the black probably means red, but that'll be for a later date. And yeah, first up, extend blob builder so consumers can better control allocations. 100418. Jared?
Yeah. So the background for this change is I've been doing a lot of investigation into the C Sharp compiler performance recently. And the kind of one of the biggest blockers we have right now in kind of compiler performance is large object heap allocations. Like we allocate just an insane amount of large objects. This is problematic for the compiler because it means basically when I kind of started this work, if you looked at a profile of the compiler, there were no Gen 0 Gen 0 runs. Like there were no Gen 0 cleanups. Every GC stop was Gen 2. Because the Gen 2 was just doing all the Gen 0s for it. And so the result is if you look at it as like we're having like massive pauses, something like 25% pause time in like the compiler when running against like projects the size of Roslyn. And so been kind of trimming them down and kind of looking into like getting rid of some of the stupid places we were doing large object heap allocations. One of our two biggest remaining sources of large object allocations is the blob builders. So for those unfamiliar, the way that when you're building up kind of a PE file in memory using like the system reflection metadata writing APIs, you do it on top of blob builders. So blob builders are very kind of analogous to string builders. So in the same way, instead of like building up a string by like appending like, string constants together, you create a string builder, you append chars, and under the hood, string builder is basically managing a set of circular buffers that you're using to build up these car arrays. Blob builder is very similar. You basically have this type has a lot of methods like write bytes, where it's just you're writing a stream of bytes, and under the hood there's a circular list of all the blob builders that are kind of managing these buffers under the hood. So when these were designed, they were designed to very much look like how String Builder looked in terms of having a lot of the same properties with circularness, reusability, things like that. They took a different strategy, though, in one specific direction where they decided linked buffers. Yes, linked, but they're also circular, depending on if you're not careful about how you walk the list. But yes, they are linked buffers. Um, so they did take one different kind of strategy approach than string builders did, where with string builders, you really have, to my understanding, no no options for like pooling. Like you just use a string builder and you get what you get under the hood. Blob builders have a different approach where they basically say, hey, we understand pooling. So you have the ability when you kind of every blob builder has a byte array backing it, and when you exhaust the space in that byte array, it has to allocate another blob builder to kind of put onto that linked buffer chain. And by virtue of having these blob builders, you can effectively intercept that allocation for the nether blob builder and say, hey, I want to, I'm going to use a pool of these blob builders, and you can understand free, so you can reuse your pools. And so that's one place in which it's different than String Builder APIs. This strategy, though, has a number of problems that we've run into. So the first one is, unlike String Builder, blob builders have this thing called linking. So you can basically build up a blob. You can take two blob builders and you can say link prefix, link suffix, which is basically put me at the end of the chain or put me at the back of the chain. Uh, the the problem we have there is there are zero guarantees that when you call link, that they came from the same pool. Like you can have a bunch of blob builders from one pool, then someone creates just a blob builder on the fly and says link me into your builder. Um, This is problematic because if you look at how the arrays are managed under the hood, you always have like you have the blob builder, which is your current pointer, and it's just swapping these linked buffers under the hood for you. So when you create a new buffer, basically the way that operation works is you create a new builder, it gets put there, you take the array from the current builder, swap it into the builder you just created, and take the array from the new builder and swap it into the current one. So these builders are holding onto these arrays and you're just hot swapping them between. Well, the problem you have there is even if you try to manage your builders, like the only option you have today for managing builder allocations is when they say, hey, allocate a builder and give me at least like 1K of byte arrays, you can choose to say like, okay, I will allocate 4K or something like that. You don't, because of the way linking and freeing works, when you link a buffer into the current builder chain, it swaps the arrays out. And so the pool of buffers that gets frees, like if when you say I allocate an object and then I free the object, the array that backs the builder has changed between the allocate and free. So you have no control over your ability to pool those arrays because they can swap owners very easily. And if you actually look at the implementation of system reflection metadata, there is very little, there is basically no attempt to ensure pools are used in all cases. And it is a very regular occurrence that like the compiler has our pool of builders that we're managing. The metadata writing APIs is actually just allocates builders on the fly and just starts linking them into our chain, which just destroys any strategy that we have it basically ruins our entire strategy for how we do pooling. And so I did some hacking on the blob builder APIs and was like running them in the compiler and trying to resolve these issues to try to come up with a set of changes that we need so that the compiler can at least have control over its allocation strategy. Because today we have very little control. Oh, the other problem we have is pretty much if you think of string builder, you go and you say append, 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 append. Let's say you append a gigantic array, so something way beyond a large object heap allocation. Internally, the string builder API actually says, heck no, we're not going to create arbitrary, large object allocations. There's a fixed limit that string builders have. I think it's like 80,000 if I remember, 40,000 or 80,000, can't remember which. And when you get beyond that limit, it will actually start chunking and just basically say, I'm not going to create a single string builder to hold all of that data. I will just basically chunk that into my maximum set here and just create a series of string builders to avoid polluting the large object heap. There is no such strategy in blob builders. Blob builders have a very simple strategy. Fill the current array and allocate an array for whatever is left. And so in cases where we're doing things like this results in lots of large object heap allocations because there are parts of the metadata writing API which are pushing down like streams. They're basically saying, here's a memory stream, go append it to the builder. And that stream is backed by a file or something of that nature, which is very big and is not a large object. But suddenly the builder is like, oh, they just told me that I need to allocate 30 megs. No problem. Let me go do a nice big byte array allocation and destroy the process. And so the proposals I have here are trying to give the compiler back control over deciding how these allocations work. Like give us some facility for understanding what is going on here, the ability for us to take advantage of array pools, actually, have our own array pool or even use the standard shared pool in instances. I think we will end up in the end deciding that it's to our advantage to have a number of large object allocations, but probably to allocate all those arrays up front, store them over here so that we're not polluting, having a bunch of like Gen 2 and fragmentation problems later. Emo?
So I assume, you said you talked to Thomas, right? So is the reason that this worked this way was because when you originally designed the APIs, you just didn't consider pooling at all?
No, they did consider pooling. And so if you actually look at it, there is there's a decent API for pooling here. There's like an allocate, a free, and a clear, and they work well. The problem is his response is basically no one had spent as much time profiling a MIT as I have, because the history of Roslyn is we wrote a compiler and we tried to ship it. Turns out getting IntelliSense performance is super, super hard. And you know who has amazing test and amazing ability to force you to fix bugs? Visual Studio. And Visual Studio doesn't emit code. And so most of the focus was on, in Roslyn towards the end, was we have to solve Visual Studio IntelliSense style perf, design time perf. The compiler performance was good enough to ship. And so that became a lesser thing that we looked at. It's only recently when I've started kind of really, due to some other investigations where we're trying to look at like, how do we improve end-to-end build performance? I started focusing a lot on kind of like, okay, where does the compiler play into this problem? And I've been staring a lot at these large object heap allocations lately and noticing that the terror that they create kind of in our like GC profile. Like if you look at our GC profile, it's very bad. There's lots of fragmentation, lots of pausing, lots of Gen 2 collections instead of like nice simple Gen 1 collections. And so and this is me trying to get it to a point where, I mean, I don't want to provide the illusion that I know exactly what I'm going to do with this API when I'm done. I have a number of prototypes that I've written where it's like I've been able to dial the GC behavior in different directions. And I'm not sure which one is ultimately going to be the one we ship. But these changes give me the ability to, at least the compiler can make strategy decisions now on how we do these allocations where we can't today. Stephen?
So I have no problem adding surface area to blob builder in support of Roslyn, which is it came from Roslyn effectively. I am curious the numbers you listed above API proposal though. This reduced GPC pause time by 1.5%. Is that accurate?
Yeah.
And that like that. if it was 100 seconds of pause time, it reduced it to 98.5 seconds of pause time?
Yeah, usually pause time is more in the, actually I have a profile up here.
I was making up a number just to do the math easy in my head, but that's less than I was expecting the number to be. 200 megabytes also seems, for a large compilation, also seems relatively small.
So 200 megabytes, it's relatively small, but it is a high percentage of like some of our like large object allocations. But I mean, if you look at like pause time in GC, like the pause time tends to be so not one point. No, sorry, it's not 1.5%. It's crap. Is it 1.5% or time in GC? Pause time, yeah, top pause time like 1.5%. Yeah, those are the right numbers.
Okay. Again, I'm fine doing anything to help. It just that doesn't seem like it would in any way move a needle.
No, it's in. So this is just the initial changes to do this. This is not in combination with the other changes I want to go and make once I have this inside of like system reflection metadata as well, which also further take another 200 megabytes of large object off of our heap and take us down another point or two. But yeah, I understand like this by itself is not, but you have to understand like this is like I've been working on this like a couple months, and so it's now like I think I've taken us down like 6 or 7% over the last. Sorry, not 6 or 7. Like I've taken our pause time down like 6 or 7 seconds for normal builds in the last few months, and like this is just keep like it's not one big thing we have to fix. It's a lot of like it's a lot of small things, and this is one where this dominates so hard. It's like any other change we make, it just gets eaten alive by the GC events that surround all of these large object allocations.
And you also think this will enable subsequent. You said you weren't done with your investigation, so you think this will, as kind of as infrastructure, this will enable you to do other investigations and other changes. Okay.
Yes, because like the big problem we have right now is like we just can't control the allocations at all. So it's like if I want to sit down and say like, okay, what would happen if we had a strategy where I think if you look at the compiler, we never really parallelize more than about like our max parallel, if you look at builds, is somewhere between, after you have more than like 4 parallel compilations going on, you've pretty much saturated the CPU, and going up to like 6, 8, or 10 in parallel doesn't really do a lot for you. And I think one of the strategies I want to kind of explore is just saying, okay, we know at most we're probably having 4 parallel compilations. We should just pre-allocate our big, large object allocations at the very start of the server, put those on the side, and then just start using them in our blob builder instead of having to kind of just demand allocate them randomly later. But I can't do that today. I have no capability of even trying that strategy out because the tool, like the underlying API, doesn't give us that. We have no ability to do that because we get like these very fine grained events of like, give me 1K of memory, and then I'm going to change the memory out from under you. And so we just have no ability to experiment, test, or do any of these kind of things. And that's what I'm really trying to get here, is just give control back to the compiler to try things and set the strategies.
Okay.
Okay. So do we want to go bit by bit, or
whatever order you think makes sense?
Yeah, as a high level, like, do we know of any other consumer besides Roslyn? Like, presumably your changes are all like you have to opt into those, so presumably they don't change behavior. Is that fair? Or
yes, that's fair, because if we actually, so part of the problem with how to generate, so I don't pretend these are perfect in any way. Some of these I know email was like, what? You want to get like protected access to the underlying buffer? That seems strange. I agree. It does. It would be a lot easier if we just said only Roslyn exists, screw everyone else. The changes would be a lot simpler. I tried to keep these in line with don't break other consumers who are out there, like try to make it like fairly like easy to deal with. Yeah. So I think the kind of ways to approach this are, if we scroll down just a little bit. Okay, yeah. So there are a couple of the particular void second. Okay, let's start from the top then. Yep. So the first one is just giving the so I think the easiest one to understand is max chunk size. So this is very analogous to what we have on String Builder today. And this is just basically allowing the owner of the blob builder to basically say, what is the maximum size that we would allocate on a single chunk? And this is to prevent like runaway large object allocations, where we effectively say that, hey, once you get to like basically don't just, if we're appending a stream into the blob, which is like a bunch of megs, don't go allocate like a 30 meg array. Like, please use chunk sizes of no more than like X bytes. So this is one where if you look at how String Builder approaches this problem, String Builder has a kind of a fixed number that they use. They don't have any ability for customization. But this is one where I believe you need to have there's no single number that is very good here. You really have to understand like what you're building up. And so I think it's easier to express as a virtual, because any fixed number can really screw you if you're dealing with certain types of builds.
It's interesting that this ends up being like, just like String Builder, Blob Builder is it links to the next Blob Builder in the chain, right?
Yeah.
So would you have a different max chunk size per instance? That seems weird.
No, it's basically you're right. It's effectively set on it's only interesting on the start builder, like when you basically the kind of the head. On all the other ones, it doesn't make any sense. I don't know a better way to express that, because they're all they're equal. They're all equal players here.
Yeah, no, I don't think we do this in String Builder, but in String Builder we just have an array of buffers where we don't actually have instances.
No, we do. String Builder has a private field that links off to the next String Builder instance. The customer doesn't see it, and it's not virtual or exposed in any way. From a consumer perspective, it's just you have a String Builder instance, and as an implementation detail, when its buffer gets too big, it creates another String Builder instance that it links to. It sounds like I'm just browsing the implementation. It looks like Blob Builder basically does the same thing, but String Builder's the equivalent of max chunk size is a const, rather than it being something configurable like this.
Is max chunk size expected to ever change during the lifetime of an object, Jared, or should it really just be a constructor parameter?
The problem with making it a constructor parameter is these are long-lived objects because of the pooling capabilities of them. So because the even with all these changes, we will still aggressively pool these values, because we create so many of them during a build. With having a constructor parameter, it means that it's hard to make dynamic decisions. Like if you see like that, okay, no, all the things we're building are bigger, we should start having bigger blob chunks. Like you can't do that later because you have a fixed set of pooled protected or something like that. Like I don't have any big objections to that. But it does seem to be this when these are inherent. I picked a virtual here because the way pooling works is you have your own derived types. If you want the customization, it just seemed like the way to do it. But if you all said, no, this is much better as a constructor parameter, I don't have any huge objections. I haven't found a huge use for dynamically changing these sizes right now.
Related to the question, and just to kind of wrap my head around this, the ability to get and set the buffer via the protected field. I thought that was because you were trying to do pooling at the byte array level, but it looks like the pooling actually happens at the blob builder level. Are you pooling at both levels?
Yes. So here's the problem we run into, and the reason why I wanted access to the buffer.
Like the way to do it.
If one of the goals of this was like if you look at
the ability to
how it works today is basically we allocate a bunch of blob builders and we pool those, and so they're sitting there doing nothing. You have a bunch of blob builders at rest doing no work that are holding on to arrays that are also doing no work. They're just taking up memory. When I started looking at like, okay, what is a better strategy? It's like if we know these things are like if you look at the implementations I've been playing with, it was like basically using the array pool and just saying let's use the array pool because this is pretty much what the array pool is meant for.
But once you did that though, like would you still pool the blob builder instances? Because at that point the blob builders, if you were nulling out the array underneath them, the blob builder objects themselves are tiny. You probably wouldn't pool those anymore, would you? You just pool the arrays that were being used to construct them?
There are tiny, but we allocate. I cannot explain to you. Like I can go grab a profile real quick of how many of those we allocate in a typical build, even with pooling. Like you end up, because of the nature of blob building, is that all the little pieces of metadata writing are creating these things constantly, and we have like thousands and thousands and thousands of them. They're one of our larger sources of allocations. Let me go grab one of these. So like even with like a better pooling strategy, because I did try strategies where we got rid of pooling, and it actually resulted in us regressing in GC because so many of these things get allocated during a complicated build.
Regressing in how much you allocated, or regressing in overall execution time? Certainly removing pooling would lower how much, would increase how much you allocate, but for really tiny objects, I'd wonder whether the overhead of, because the GC effectively is itself a pool, so you're just trading off the overhead of your pool versus the GC as a pool. And for large things, doing your own pooling can be better. That's why we have array pool. But for small things, I wonder.
Okay. I mean, I
could be
definitely
wrong. And it might, some of the overhead that comes from pooling is also making it thread safe and having concurrent access. So if it was just, a single thread is holding on to a handful of these and it knows it's going to need a new one, so it just holds on to the previous one and reuses it, like that I get. But a broad thread safe process wide pool, I'd be really curious to understand that more.
And like I said, I'm going to keep saying, I don't want to imply I have all the answers here. I'm mostly trying to like get it to the point where we can actually make decisions like this.
Sure. And to be clear, the APIs already exist for doing the pooling at the blob builder level, it looks like. So that's not what's being added here. What you're talking about adding here is actually the ability to do pooling at the array level, which is what I would expect would make more sense anyway. So I don't think that gets in the way of anything here. I just try to understand the overall design and expectations.
Yeah, so to give you an example, on like the same build where I'm from the kind of the same place where I can kill like 200 megabytes of large object heap allocations, even with pooling, we allocate 500 megs of these objects.
These objects being the blob builder objects or the arrays?
Yeah. So we allocate
because the blob builders shouldn't end up on the large object heap.
No. That's just a standard like 500 megs of like allocations. Like the profile says we're allocating like 5,000 of them, and it's causing like 500 megs, which still seems high, but no.
How much I'm curious then how much you actually saving by pooling? Like
a lot. Let me pull. I had a profile where I wrote this API design like 2 months ago. And so, like, let me see.
Again, I'm kind of getting off into the weeds because I don't think my questions directly affect what you've exposed here.
Yeah. We get, like, honestly, these are, like, I wrote this, like, a couple months ago, so some of the memory of some of the investigations I've done and faded. But I tried various strategies for pooling, and I was quite frankly shocked at how many of these things we allocate once I started looking at it. And a couple ideas I had on like reducing and increasing the pool did not have were very surprising and fun. But it is something that I have actively like tried to look at of like what should our pooling strategy for these things be if we can control the underlying arrays better. Like I have looked at like just giving up on pooling a few times, and I haven't settled on. There was not an easy answer that I saw.
No, I can totally believe that pooling the arrays is helpful. It's the tiny wrapper for the array that I'm wondering about. But that's neither here nor there.
Yeah, but even in the case where you say that like I don't want to do pooling of these guys anymore, I just want to focus on the arrays, I would still argue give me that setter, because
that's what I'm saying. Then you need the setter because you need to be able to. You don't actually. What were you going to say? Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say it's like the ownership model for these items is not very well established. Like one of the biggest, like there is a general pattern of how these things are used where people tend to allocate the typical ownership model for these guys is you create a blob builder, you write some data to it, and then you link it to a blob builder and you wash your hands of it. There's nothing stopping people from holding on to them and using them for long periods of time. I found places in the compiler where we were doing that. And it was, is this right or wrong? And the problem with it is like, if I want to use array pooling under the hood for these things, when we call free and they go away, like if I return the array, I want to kill the reference to it in these builders, the array I just returned, in case there is someone who held on to one of these because they don't have 100% ironclad ownership model. I don't want them writing into an array I just returned to the pool. And so I wanted the ability to kill these things very definitively, to like lock them off. And this was the reason for wanting access to the underlying buffer, is wanting the ability to say like, okay, I am, I need to be able to understand how this, I need to be able in the cases where when I put the array back in the pool, I want to like completely get rid of that.
I see.
And again, I put the getter and setter here as a protected. That was the easiest way for me to get at it. I don't know if there are better patterns for this that I should have leaned into. And that's why we're here. I don't know if there are better patterns.
How should I think about the nullability of the protected byte array?
I was thinking, so what I ended up, the way I thought about that for a while too, where I was like, should it be like, I was trying to think of it like, do we think of this as a free operation? A free operation is when you would kind of kill the byte array. And I was like, do we think of it like dispose, where with dispose, we tend to say we have like fields, which are, it's okay.
Nullability contracts are off the table because you're basically saying this object is no longer usable. Contracts aren't relevant.
Exactly. I thought a lot about that complication for a while, and then I came to what I thought was a much simpler answer. I just put array.empty in there when I'm done with it.
Okay.
So it's like just throw array.empty in there. It's a zero link builder. It's very simple.
So Jared, I'm a little confused because if you're describing this as you would only want to set it again during a free operation, why don't you just override free?
Jared doesn't have access to the private byte array field.
Gotcha.
That's the problem.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Yeah, and so it's like
this is you want to
fundamental.
You want to implement free as swapping the array with one not in the pool.
Yeah, just when these things are even. So then either the two cases are I don't do pooling. I'm done with this thing. I don't know if someone's holding on to it. I want to get rid of the array. But even in the pooling case, if this thing is at rest and not being used, I don't want to hold on to this array that I could put back in the pool and let someone else use it while this thing is at rest. That's just, it feels like that is just wasting time. That's wasting resources.
Sorry, in my head I heard this as we were making a new way to do a thing you could do, but you're making the design of the type actually be capable of functioning.
Correct.
So, yeah, so the reason I asked should max chunk size be a constructor parameter, the initial question, which came from YouTube chat, is what would the type do if somebody wrote this as return the call count of max chunk size, so that it doesn't stay the same every time you call it? And so then that's the should it be a field? Should it be a only a one-time set field? Does it make sense to let it change? That's where the question.
I mean, from a usability perspective, I mean, you're true. Like you could just return, if people returned random numbers from there, it would be bad. Like I said, if the feeling is like this is better as a field, like I don't really have any objections to it. I put a virtual in there because I thought it was just I was virtualing a few other things. It made sense. I don't really have any like hard objections to that being a field. It would be, I think, somewhat sensible.
Do we make protected fields on anymore? I mean, is that a thing we do? I thought we didn't do that.
I mean, we could make it a protected get set, which is the same as being a field. This is a virtual get only.
I thought you were talking about the buffer. Sorry.
Yeah. No, for the max chunk size, if we did like a field, I would say it's a constructor parameter and you set it and you never read it. It would just be a new parameter we would add a new overload to the constructor that has like the max chunk size as an argument. We would get rid of the virtual and just say you set it at construction and you set what you set, and that's it. So, I like I said, if that's the better design philosophy for this, I don't really have an objection to it. That would be fine by me. If you want to keep going, having a protected constructor where I can directly give you the byte array. Today, the way it works is there's only one constructor. When you call it, the strategy is it just allocates an array off the heap and puts it into there. Having the protected constructor gives us the ability to say, like, no, here's the byte array. We can do the pooling that we want to do and just pass it up to you instead.
How does that work when it decides that it needs to make a new one in the chain?
The way it works when it makes a new one in the chain is the way chaining works is when you exhaust the current byte array, a new builder is allocated. You take the current, and then you take the arrays from the builders and swap them. And this is also how Stream Builder works.
Right. I'm just saying, who gets to decide what buffer got passed in here when it is doing the linking?
That's when there is an allocate method on these objects, which is already there. If you look at the Blob Builder API, There's an alloc method, which is virtual, and that's where the pooling comes in. So basically, Blob Builder has two virtual methods that are interesting, alloc and free. And so whenever when you're doing write bytes and you get past the end of the buffer, you get to respond to an alloc call and provide the new Blob Builder. And then the arrays between the two are swapped and the writing continues.
Gotcha.
When it does that, it just moves up the blob builder class, right, and not any kind of derived class. There's no way for it to do that.
Now, when you're doing pooling, so what happens is, like, if you look at how if you look at Roslyn, Roslyn has pooled blob builder, which is a derivation of this. And when you call alloc, we return a new instance of our pooled type. You can also look. There's a pooled builder example within the runtime. So if you just search for pooled blob builder, you can see like they have an implementation. See right there. So collection metadata. See if you look at allocate chunk is basically doing a new. Oh wait, they do new. Why are they doing that? They're not actually doing. You look for heap builder. But you can see here. This is how the general. Heap blob builder, I think they do better pooling. Oh no, yeah, so they're overriding it to return their derived types because they want to control the capacity of these. They basically have their own definition of what like minimal sizes should be in these pools.
And then I'm assuming the the free chunk method would it free from the pool or when does it get free?
Free happens when you're done with a blob builder. You call free. Free is kind of a public non-virtual method. It then goes to every one of the linked things, calls clear, calls free chunk, and then calls free chunk on the head. And so free chunk is where you can basically start throwing things back into your pool. So if you go and look at like free is a void, it's like void free in there. And you'll see that that's going to call clear and free chunk, clear chunk and free chunk on everything. No, look, yeah, there you go. So free is like free chunk, and free chunk goes through. Yeah, clear and free. Clear and free goes through, calls free, throw things back in the pool.
Yeah. But again, the problem being you actually can't semantically do that because you don't have access to that field.
Yeah, so we can't be good. We can't do the things we would like to do. So capacity, hopefully that's explanatory. Just the ability to just set the underlying capacity on the builder. If you actually look at that entire heap blob builder type that's there, they're doing all this custom pooling and all they're trying to do is set capacity. That's literally the only thing that builder is trying to do. And them having a separate builder means that they reduce the ability for us to do pooling correctly because they mix their builders into our builders. And so we suddenly like lose the ability to control allocations.
So does this also mean with the pooled buffer or pooled blob builder that you said earlier, I think, that the base class will allocate an array, so it's just kind of sitting there. I think the default is like 256 bytes or something like that, but you don't have access to it, but it will still allocate that. I mean,
well, yeah, you have no access to the underlying array.
I mean, if you have the pooled blob builder, you will have your own array, right?
Maybe because of swap. So this is the complication. So in a world where there is one, in a world where all of the blob builders come from one pool, you don't control the arrays because under the hood they're allocated by the blob builders, but you can assume some consistency in where they came from. The problem is because you can mix builders, you start getting arrays from a bunch of different sources, and it becomes very sketchy on where everything came from. One of my indirect goals with all of these changes is I'm going to go into your guys' code base, hopefully in a month or two, and delete all of your pools and start just letting the actual system reflection metadata driver control all the pooling. But we still can't be guaranteed that that's true in all cases.
And so what
I think
does setting so
setting,
setting capacity is going to do what?
Just set the size of the backing array for this instance. It's no different than setting capacity on a list, on a string builder. It's just let me size the underlying array to a very specific one.
But what does it mean when you're already in a linked mode?
You cannot. I probably should have put that. That's only valid for the head chunk. That's only valid for most of the APIs on Blob Builder are only valid if you're dealing with the head. If you're dealing with anything which has been kind of linked in the chain, most of the APIs throw. Setting capacity would absolutely throw if you are not at the head of the Blob Builder.
Right, but for the head, it would add a new link if it needed to grow, and it would drop links if it needed to shrink?
No. It's saying set the capacity for this builder.
For just the head node?
Yeah, just the head node. Capacity is different than like overall size.
So length can exceed capacity? Assuming length is itself chained?
Yes. Now that's a good question. I did not think about we might Steve, when you set capacity on string builder and it exceeds mass chunk size, like how does that work? Is capacity in string builder controlling the current builder or the Uber set of builders?
I honestly don't know the answer off the top of my head, but I can look.
Because I would not want that name to be the same if they have different behaviors.
Right, because my at least naive understanding of string builder is capacity is your total capacity, and the linking is a hidden detail. You don't, as the caller, you don't know if it's in a linked state or not. It's just how it manages its arrays. I would not be surprised to be wrong, but that's what I would expect.
While we're looking at that, I think we could go over the other methods and come back to that. And because I would basically, if capacity doesn't control the current builder capacity, then I would want a better name for that to make it very clear that you're controlling the capacity of like the current builder. It also, if I went and looked back at it, I think it doesn't really. I think all the places we set capacity today, they basically create a new builder and set the capacity. So it really wouldn't be a big difference. So I think the API that might be the most challenging to understand, because it took me a while to really understand what was going on here, is the before swap one. So the challenge, as I mentioned with these pools, is they are not homogeneous. It is perfectly okay, and in fact very much done today, that you have a pool of blob builders and other blob builders from other pools get pushed into your pool via link suffix and link prefix. And that is very problematic, because when that happens, you have two pools that have different strategies for how they're managing memory and how they're managing their arrays. And then we say, hey, by the way, we're going to put these together and we're going to swap their arrays around. And there's no way for you to know what happened today. Like, neither of the pools know that happened. You just are like the link suffix, link prefix, they happen. And the arrays get swapped and you have no hook. This is devastating if you're trying to do any type of array pooling, because suddenly the array that you had, which you think is safe to return to a pool, got swapped with an array that is not safe to return to a pool because someone else allocated it. And so this virtual method, and I hate the name, so I would love any other name, is basically when a link event happens, which is the place you can be mixing builders from different pools, both builders get called. You're about to be linking with this other, like basically you call like A dot before swap B, B dot before swap A, where both pools get an event where they can basically see a swap is about to happen, and you can actually make rational decisions on what to do at that point if you get mixed with another pool. For example, in the case, if you look at the Roslyn implementation side of this, is I basically say if I'm being swapped with a blob builder from another pool, I poison the current builder and say you can never return your array to the array pool, because like this is now an array that's coming from an unknown source. I don't know where it came from. That array that I got from the pool, I kind of have to abandon from the pool because I no longer control when it's freed, because the other pool controls when it's freed. And so this is just a place where it's a necessary step for any kind of pooling for us to know that this thing is about to happen, and we need to take steps to make good decisions about what we're doing with pooling here. Like I said, I hate the name. I would love it if someone had a better name. The other method here, set capacity, is just the implementation of if capacity is set to a higher level, like that's an allocation event, and the pooler needs to make a decision on what do I do. Like the pooler can use that to basically say, I can now rent a bigger array from the pool, return my old array from the pool. They're entirely control of the set capacity change in terms of copying data and things like that. But it's just the hook to basically say, this is another place where an allocation happens, and we need to be able to control that and do pooling on it. Okay. All right, so Steven said in the chat that capacity, yeah, so capacity is set up to do an entire thing. Okay, so I at least need to come back and think about how I need to go back and, whatever else we decide about these APIs, I need to go back and look at the cases where I was using capacity to make a determination of if it should be the entire blob builder set or just like the current chunk. So I will need to do some.
Yeah, I think Blob Builder, I haven't looked at all the APIs, but Blob Builder seems like it's a little different from String Builder in that the public API service on Blob Builder exposes the fact that it's a linked list of instances. Okay. String Builder doesn't. From a consumer of String Builder perspective, it's an implementation detail, whether it has a single array that grows, whether it's a linked list of instances, whatever it does. You don't know that under the covers String Builder actually can reference other String Builders.
Okay.
Unrelated to all the discussion thus far, the write bytes method at the bottom there, why isn't that public?
Because I was putting a bunch of protected methods in there. It should be public. I was literally just looking at that. That should absolutely be public. Yeah. Hopefully that API is not controversial. I'd really like to Spanify.
There's a whole bunch of write methods already, right? They're public, void, write, blah. And this is just one for read-only span.
No. There's a this method exists. It's protected. It's private. There's a private write bytes method that takes a span. It's fucking maddening that someone added that and they didn't make it public. It's like, what? That's exactly what, like, why? Why would we not make that public? It's like exactly what I want. But anyway, so yeah, that needs to be public. Okay. Then if you scroll down, the rest of the APIs are solving a slightly different problem. So as I mentioned before, if you look at how PE building works today, the idea is we want to be able to pool and control allocations and let kind of like the compiler decide how all of this stuff works. There are a number of places today where we have APIs that are they just basically create their own blob builders and throw them into the pool and make the pool heterogeneous, which kills any kind of strategies you have for like pooling, array renting, and things like that. These APIs are basically, I track down all the places where we are just kind of newing up blob builders, and I'm instead saying, let the compiler or the metadata builder control the allocation of blobs. So the first one is adding an overload to metadata builder. So metadata builder already has a constructor with the 4 parameters listed there. It's adding an overload that has a 5th parameter, which is a func that just says given us, it's just basically create a blob builder for the given size. This class is not something that is deriven from, so there's no place to put a virtual here. There needs, like, a delegate was the way I saw as basically having the kind of extensibility functions there, because it does not allocate things immediately. I could not just pass a blob builder directly into this. Instead, I had to pass a func to say go allocate it later. In the case that's contrary to the debug directory builder, where the bug directory builder immediately allocates a blob builder and starts using it. And so it was much simpler to say, let me just have a constructor parameter where I just pass the blob builder in for you. I'll just allocate it and give it to you. That one's very nice and easy. The manage PE builder, that type creates a number of different blob builders throughout its usage. When it's building up section tables and string tables, it allocates a lot of these things. Compilers, we already derive from this type when we are building up PE files. This is part of what we do. This is like, it's a customizable type. So for me, it made a lot of sense to just say, just add a virtual method here, where we can, instead of just doing new blob builder everywhere, we can override and just basically plug in our own builders. Yeah, and there is a link down there where I basically have a pointer to like what Roslin's pooling strategy looks like, a version of the Roslin pooling strategy I have once I made all of these changes. Alternative designs is one you could come back to me and say, renting from the array pool doesn't matter, Jared. You should just focus on pooling these little builder types, in which case, like, we could slim down the API surface that I'm asking for here. It would mostly come down to before swap and a few other things. In particular, these last little 3 APIs would still be very important in a place where you told me don't use the array pool, just kind of focus on pooling these types. That's an alternative design we could consider. I did outline what I think are a number of risks that I really try to keep in mind when doing this. Roslin's not the only compiler, so we really have to think about that. Can you scroll down a little bit, please? And so I was pretty try to be very conscious of the fact that Roslin's not the only person using this API when I was designing these changes. These changes alone do not guarantee that every place we call link prefix and link suffix come from the Roslin blob builder. So even in this design, it is not a fully homogeneous set of builders. I do have a follow-up change where I'm that I would want to consider completely separately, where I feel like I can get rid of, there are still 2 places where system reflection metadata is doing some of their own pooling that I think is unnecessary once we have these APIs. And I'm hopeful that I can actually come through later with a completely separate change later, fix those areas up using these APIs and get it to homogeneous, but it's not 100% necessary for this proposal. This proposal can still go forward on its own. We can still make we still have a lot more control over how things work, and we can feel good about it. There also is the risk, as I mentioned, max chunk size. Depending on how big or small you make that, you can really change the number of blob builder instances that get created. I made some devastatingly bad decisions at the start. So that's a risk for people who take advantage of these APIs, that this is definitely like profile before you use any of these APIs. No one's telling me how bad the names are. Is anyone paying attention?
Yeah, I was gonna say, so now that we've talked about the functionality, so I'll start with on create blob builder. You've used a nullable int here. Does it matter that it's nullable, or should this be a 0 means do whatever you want, or -1 is do whatever you want?
zero as a default here is perfectly fine by me. That makes like if I like I said, I want to lean into like this is a design I would have done if I was writing my own code. But I would much rather, whatever. I'm sure this is not the first time we've had this kind of like default thing in the VCL. So whatever you all tend to have here, I think saying like minimum size, having it be non-nullable and say minimum size equals 0, that's perfectly workable.
Is minimum size equals 0 going to have issues? Most of the time when we're talking about buffers, collections, and other sizes, we differentiate between 0, meaning don't give me a size, like make it empty, and the sentinel value, which means use the system default size. So like if you do new list 0, it is different from new list, which doesn't specify 1.
That's true. I mean, I agree. So like I said, I definitely want to infer that the differentiate between the just pick a size case versus specific size. There is no case today with blob builders where people pass 0. Like you always allocate at least like the min chunks, the min size, which I think is like 256. So there's no case of like have 0 like capacity. It's just basically the default. If you pass the, like, it would be very reasonable for us to say 0 equals pick the default.
Yeah, the current constructor, if capacity is negative, it throws, and then it will lift it to a minimum of 16.
Interestingly, I was just looking at list, and if you set capacity to 0, it sets the initial array to a static 0 length array.
Yeah. For some reason, list respects change to be actually empty.
I think enough people like probably create a 0 length list instead of like enumerable.empty or something was worth optimizing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're not entirely consistent, but I feel like with an input parameter at least, we're usually like, if we can use 0 or -1 to be a do whatever you want, it uses one less register when calling
that sounds great. If you guys, like you were saying, you're not always consistent, I'm surprised no one's pointed out that I'm not always consistent because the func I passed does not have an int nullable. It has a straight int too.
Yep.
So okay, I think int and 0 equals do the default is completely reasonable because you're passing the buck to the builder and the pooling API, and we already have to make decisions on what is there. There are absolutely times where we know what to pass and we are very good about passing the sizes down, but in the rest, the compilers picked a default for years and it's been fine. So I think having it be int minimum size equals 0 is perfectly fine, and that would also give me consistency with my other decision up there with the delegate.
Okay. Yeah, I'll say from YouTube chat, there was a suggestion that instead of using func of int to blob builder here, that we create a named delegate for this, but I believe the guidelines say use func unless you have to write like it's a func of int and int to blob builder, because now you need to name the ints. So I think this is correct, but I'm relaying the concern.
Yeah, but I think that there's a
yeah, so there've been a couple things from chat regarding capacity and capacity. So for one, I assume the structure that is here basically sets this up as the template method pattern of this setter is going to reject negative numbers and then call this.
Before we get to capacity, there's one other thing I wanted to talk about with metadata builder.
Okay.
Sorry. Because I made this nullable and no one said anything. One thing, so Metadata Builder is odd in that it's one of the few APIs I've dealt with in the BCL that has default parameter values that are public. There's not a ton of those that we do. The existing constructor on Metadata Builder has all of these 4 parameters, all with basically default values of 0. And so in constructing this, I was not sure the best what the current pattern is of like adding another parameter, because if I add another parameter and keep everything as like, do I add another parameter, keep all the defaults, give it all the same optional default values? That seems like it's going to create overload resolution problems. Having it have the non-default values, but then still giving like create Bob Builder a default value is problematic if you pass the 4 integers, because I guess it will default to the other one, but it's a little weird. So I didn't know the best way to approach this. In retrospect, I probably would remove that nullable and say if you're calling this overload, give a real value. But you can if you look at the metadata builder, you'll see that it is one of those ones where it does do that. It does have a bunch of optional values. So I don't know what your all preferred pattern is for adding an overload in this case.
Right. So
in Roslyn, the way we would do an overload is we would add an overload, delete all of the default the values here. The new overload would replicate the default values and put the default value of null in for the delegate as well. But that is the Roslyn pattern for how we deal with these type of changes. I do not know what your all's pattern for this is.
Put editor browsable never on this one, and then you've stated our pattern.
So basically, put editor browsable never here, delete the defaults, and then add the defaults in the new overload.
Yep.
Okay. Sounds good.
So yeah, that's our strategy.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just wanted to finish that bit, so
that's
happy to go back to capacity now.
Yeah. So I assume that set underscore capacity is going to reject negative numbers and then dispatch to virtual set capacity.
Set underscore capacity. So the reason I did not just make like the setter virtual is that I feel like this is a place where you definitely want to have some like built-in validation. Cannot have negative numbers, cannot be called on non-head versions of the builder. So there's absolutely like core validation we want to do here before we then say now default some of the behavior to the underlying thing.
Right. So
yes, it would
template method.
It would validate negative numbers, validate head, and then call down into set capacity at that point.
And would this ever be called anywhere other than from the property setter?
No.
Okay, so it would only ever apply to the head node, and it's just you're in a validated input state. Go deal with yourself.
Exactly.
And
I can make that clear in the doc comments if that helps.
No, that's the flow that I assumed, minus the whole part about the head node being special. And is there if there's a node type that wants to reject a capacity as being too big, it can't? Like it just has to throw and reject?
Yeah, it has to throw. Yeah.
Okay, because there was a question of should this be capable of returning a builder saying that it had to go chunk this out or whatnot, but I didn't understand the chunking strategy, so I'll tell you that question was asked. I don't know what it means.
Okay, yeah, and I would say that's I'd be curious now. Actually, like, I want to look at String Builder because, like I said, I do want to I would like to have some flimsy decisions on what to do with capacity, and I want to go back and I want to look more at String Builder's use of capacity compared to the places I knew capacity was going to be used on this, and I want to firm up some decisions around that and come back and talk about that later. But yeah, there's all the cases. So all the cases today where the capacity was used, it was a very deliberate decision that it needed to be it could not be a chunked array. And the reasons for that is some of the lower level writing APIs on the builders, they basically assume the lower level parts of the metadata building APIs assume they are what okay, sorry, let me try this again. Most of the places in Blob Builder are string builder uses. There's like, man, whatever, I'm writing some bytes, I don't care. Like, just keep allocating, I'm writing bytes. There's some low level APIs within there when you're writing out like instruction sets in some of the token maps, where the code has a very hard assumption that I said that this builder is going to have X bytes, and those X bytes are contiguous. I can grab a pointer to them and just start writing. And so capacity is used in those cases where it's like it needs a absolute, like an array which will be this long at least, that it can then start like writing into.
Okay, and can that exceed max chunk size?
Yeah, it has to. It is something that you have to be able to tolerate, because there are parts of the underlying builders where they just have a hard assumption that I will get a contiguous array and I can do what I want with it. And I have looked. That is basically just, it is a implementation detail of the current thing. It is possible to complicate that writing code to be able to deal with the fact that you can have these spaced arrays. That is not something I wanted to undertake right now. But like I said, I do want to come back. So I have all that in mind. I do want to go look at those places we did capacity again. I want to come back and talk about that another time when I've paged some of that in, and I want to go look at String Builder again and make sure that I'm somewhat wary of having it, because this is such a patterned off of String Builder. If capacity does something differently here than in String Builder, I would probably want to come back and ask for a different name, or something that is more like, this is the capacity of the current builder, something along those lines. But I do need to go back and look at all the use cases to be really confident in my decisions there. Anyone have a better name than Before Swap? Before Link, like, I don't care. Like, I hate that name.
Yeah.
But I don't also know any other place where we do this type of insanity that I could use, find as a pattern that I could pick a better name from.
Right. So for events, which technically this is not an event, for events, guidelines, and if you want to know why, you have to ask Christoph and not me. It says do not use before or after prefixes. So
cool.
If it was an event, it would be called on swapping.
On link, because this is all link suffix and link prefix, on link would be kind of in line with those APIs.
Yeah. Do give event names with the concept of before and after using present and past tenses such as closing and closed. So it'd be on linking.
On linking sounds great.
Personally, I think before swap sounds better, but on linking matches guidelines.
Look, if you agree with me on naming and you're in charge of this meeting, like, that's not good.
I'm in charge of the meeting because I have a gavel. Like,
hey, no.
Gavel doesn't make you right.
I got a gavel too.
But maybe being right maybe gave me a gavel. I need to see Jared's gavel. Where'd the video go?
I can't remember why Emo bought me the gavel.
Emo also bought me the gavel. So apparently Emo likes gavels.
Because I was hoping for a moment where you're both on stream and you both have a gavel and you're trying to compete for competition.
Awesome. All right. On linking, I like. So I think, is there any real questions about having the protected constructor where the derived types can just give the array straight? I mean, that seemed fairly straightforward to me. Because I think that the two other parts are ones that we would probably end up want to have a little more question about. One is, should the max chunk size be virtual, or should it be basically a field that we pass up? I'm perfectly okay with it being a field, and I'm perfectly okay like saying, let's have a constructor parameter and you set it there. That's completely fine by me.
I think in a vacuum, I'd rather it be a field and set with the constructor, but I wonder how that's like. We currently have an int-based constructor. You want to add a byte array-based constructor, and then would both of them need a max chunk size? Would only the int one get a max chunk size because this one has already picked its buffer? No, because it's about creating new yeah. So
yes, new chunks. It would.
So making this as a constructor parameter requires adding not one constructor but at least two, because we'd want to overload the int one and then presumably make a default on this one.
Possibly. I would also, I think you could also make the argument that, like, who's setting max chunk size if they're not also trying to rent the arrays? Like, you're not setting that value unless you're, like, really concerned with how the allocations are occurring, so you're passing that byte array anyway. So I think you could make the argument that you're not doing this unless you're also trying to rent the arrays, so we only need one constructor, but I wouldn't push back on having two.
All right. So you think it would only need to go here?
Yeah. And this is another case where I would say that if we've leaned into the idea, this is another case where I'd say, like, do we want to max chunk size? Do we want to say, we already said earlier, min allocation size equals 0. Do you want to make this a nullable, or do you want to make this an int at that point?
Right. And so what's the behavior if it's null?
If it's null, it's just allocate whatever you want. It's the current behavior of just, there's no max, just allocate whatever the current request is.
Because once it's a field, the current constructor is going to have to set it. So we're just deciding, is the field itself nullable or not. Again, we could say 0 makes no sense in context, so that 0 means max chunk size was not specified.
Yeah. So in terms of the actual field, I would say no matter what decision you make in this API, the field is going to be an int, and we'll do bit magic to basically determine, because this type already does all kinds of, like, length. Freaking length has bit magic. Like, the length field has, like, a set at the top to say that's how they determine, like, head or not. So bit magic is already done everywhere in this type. Like, we would just make this an int as a field and just use bit magic to say, like, it was not specified.
Yeah, but again, 0 might be that.
Yeah, 0 is fine. Yeah, I mean, we could determine the implementation there, but I want us to consider this, considering that we said that we got rid of nullable because we just wanted to embrace, like, equals whatever before. I just want to make sure we consider that.
Right. I mean, here,
I think
the property design, it makes sense to
exactly
share the, like, oh, no one overrode this versus, like, yeah, explicitly, I don't care or whatever. But do we think this one should be defaulted?
I would say, especially if it's not nullable, I think we should default it to the don't change behavior value. So I would say, particularly if it's nullable, it should be equal 0. If it's a nullable value, then I would say you can avoid the default because it's very clear what null means in that circumstance.
So just on the use of this, I assume it's to prevent large object heap for Roslyn. Is that? I mean,
yeah.
You said 80K or something like that.
Yeah, we would set 80. Well, possibly. But so I will say that, like, I've done one strategy, which is, I said, made it 80K. That does kill the large that it is very effective in getting rid of large object heap allocations. That does have a side effect of you allocate significantly more builders if you take that approach. So it's a bit of a trade-off. I think what likely would end up happening with Roslyn is we would probably set we might just large object heap allocations for the way these builders design are somewhat unavoidable. But what we would probably, the next type of strategy I want to try is basically pre-allocating a number of large object arrays just at the very start. So, and then just reusing them in the cases. So I think we would probably end up, definitely I'm going to experiment with ideas where we just have arrays that are deliberately on the large object heap that we can reuse here, but we'll see.
Okay, yeah, it just wasn't clear to me who's going to first of all, know what the size is ahead of time, and then second, I guess, is how do they does it matter? Does it matter if somebody passes it too big? Yeah, it gets add to the LOH, but if it's all internal Roslyn code, for example, that's a different issue that can be caught internally.
Yeah. And then Stephen Tobe had brought up the idea of like, do we even have protected like fields or properties anymore? I wrote this with like method. I had versions of this where I'm like, oh, you could have protected like set buffer, but then I also need to get the original buffer too, and so I ended up, instead of having protected get virtual buffer set buffer, I just made it a property.
Yeah, it seems fine. And
Okay.
I assume the property's gonna wrap the field.
Yeah, it's just going to wrap the field with, I would likely go through, and the only thing I would do is in the setter, just basically say you can't set it to null. Like you have to give about, even if it's array.empty, you have to give like, just to keep this, to not add complications elsewhere in the types.
Mm-hmm.
So you are missing one API here in your little notes. You're missing the metadata builder API changes. Oh, there they are. Yeah.
They were more complicated because we actually had to remove lines.
Okay, perfect. Awesome. I mean, from my perspective, this looks good. I'm pretty happy with it. I want to. I don't know how you guys, administratively do these things, but I want to go back myself and look at capacity again and come back and have a conversation about that. Or I don't know if email is. I'm hoping it will be like a 5-minute conversation once I kind of look into that.
I mean, generally, it's if you think this is the shape, but you reserve the right to change your mind, then we talk about it as if this is the final answer, and if you need to change it, we talk about it again. If you're concerned it's probably the wrong shape, then we would delete it now and then talk about it again later.
I think it's probably the right shape. I would then like to reserve the right and come back if I feel like it has differed enough compared to String Builder, and that the two people who are familiar, because it's like people who care about perf are going to like, if I feel like the shapes are close but have different enough implementations that might cause confusions, I reserve the right to come back and argue for a worse name on that or a different API.
Yeah, so question in chat, what does get buffer do if you're not the head node? Throw? But I guess it's protected, so we don't, like, generally gets don't throw, but if it's protected, maybe we don't care.
So you need to be able to access it when you're not the head node. So I need to go.
Because this is,
I'm not
you
sure
put the comment,
when
this can only be called on the head of the chain.
Yes.
Maybe you just meant that for the set?
No, because I believe that when you so the only thing I'm trying to think through is during free part. So the way blob builders are free, if you have kind of when you're freeing a non-head node, I believe we clear the bit first so that it become. I believe the core free happens. It gets set back to a head node, and then we call into the free chunk. Because we have to be able to access get in free chunk, because that's where you're basically you're looking at the array and potentially pushing it back into the pool. So in free chunk, we have to be able to call the getter. I believe that by the time you get into free chunk, it has already been remarked as a head. So that should be there. But I think the invariant is it needs to be called in free chunk. If we are already marked as a head by then, so let's see, clear. If not is, so clear is not his head. Clear and free chunk. Clear chunk is basically, length goes 0. Yeah, so it should only be called. It should only be outside of being a head node. It should throw 2.
Okay, so the time you would need to call it would be in free, and in free it's callable.
Yeah.
Sorry, I think I just missed this, but since there's a break, we removed the max chunk size property, even though it's a constructor parameter. Is the idea that it's just gonna like throw if you request more than that, and there's nothing you can do, or?
No. Today, the way max chunk size works today is it's basically it calls allocate chunk and passes the size in, and you have to be able to respect the size of allocate chunk. So for there's no situation in when you should throw in any of these APIs. Like I said, there are cases like with capacity where the existing things today say like they are going to request a contiguous block of memory and you have to give it to them because the underlying APIs require it. So there's never a case where you would throw here. The case would be you make a decision of this is outside the bounds of things we want to pool, so just call new. Just give them back a new array and forget about it. And then you have to be responsible for that decision.
Oh, so could we rename it like max pool chunk size? I mean, it's kind of nitty, but
I picked max chunk size
because
because it's Stream Builder.
Well, and this is is only for the expand implementation, right?
Yep.
Right.
This is only when you're calling like write bytes and there's not enough memory in the current array and they have to allocate a new chunk.
So that right here, aside from style violation of using var when they're not allowed to, this says just call it with the new length, lift it up to 16, and you'd have a more complicated flow here of if the new length is bigger than max chunk size, then we're going to do this in a loop.
I see, and that's why the base type has to know is it wants to allocate or request the max chunk size and nothing more in that case.
Yep.
All right. Thank you. Sorry.
So only for the
already been.
I'm pushing a gigabyte at you in one call, and instead of allocating 1 gigabyte sub builder, it's going to allocate gigabyte divided by chunk size.
All right.
Yep.
Sorry, I know that you had talked about some of that at least. But
no,
thanks
this is
for
so.
repeating.
This is not a simple like. Stream Builder is simple because it has no derivations. It's like, all right, we have a strategy and we're going to go for it. This has derivations and like half of the capabilities and strategy of Stream Builder. Like a lot of this was me spending a week just really trying to understand how this insanity worked. So it is not. Do not feel sorry for asking questions about it. It is complicated.
Okay, I was responding to a thing in chat where I was administratively renaming the parameter of write bytes from buffer to source, thinking it was a completely new method, but there's an existing write bytes that takes byte array called buffer, and
yep, that's
so
why I chose buffer
Chad
because
is
it's just
right that we
following the
should
pattern.
match the name.
Yep.
So, okay, so I think the only thing that is left is just about capacity and should anyone ever see a non-head node? I guess if they call the link before.
Yeah, if you call link before and keep playing with the thing, like it will throw. So like yes, you can see it, but like you're already kind of like your code is probably throwing unless you just squirreled it away and looked at it later, and it just happened we'd already freed it.
Okay, so an average user would never be in a state where they would call set capacity and get a thou shalt only do this on the head node exception.
Yeah, no. Yeah, they would not. You have to go. You have to basically really mess up the APIs. It's like you have to like create a builder, link it into something, and then try to set the capacity. Like it's like you're playing with an object after it's disposed.
Fair enough. All right. Anybody have other questions or concerns?
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks everyone. I really appreciate the kind of feedback here, and happy with the results. And I'm looking forward to remembering all the craziness about capacity. Awesome. All right. I have to run to another meeting, but definitely if you have any other questions, happy to follow up. So, all right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Jared. Oh, it's the bug again. Yeah, it worked. All right. One day I will remember that just doesn't work reliably. Alrighty. Next up, type descriptor related trimming support 101-202. That's a fun number.
Okay. We can start here. You want to scroll to the top? I'm just going to read it off of your share here.
I mean,
So basically,
I was gonna say we can probably skip the purpose and just talk about the thing, and unless you think that we're gonna ask questions about literally every member.
no, I mean, I'll give you a very, very quick summary of it. Basically, this primarily is for WinForms. WinForms has a whole bunch of issues with native AOT support, and this is just one of many issues that WinForm ran into, and this is addresses those issues on system component model. Basically, there's these RUC and DAM attributes applied everywhere today. No real work went into refactoring or trying to fix up system component model, especially type descriptor. And when these attributes were added, and this is an attempt to allow WinForms to be trimmed so it can be used properly in native AOT. The general approach is basically three things. One is a register method, so you can say, hey, this is a kind of a known type, and that method will have the DAM attribute, which is reflection based. And then at that point, all of the other methods basically just have a suffix called from register type, and without the attribute, in this case, the DAM attribute, or there's some RUC attributes as well. And this kind of preserves backwards compatibility. It doesn't break existing users of component model. And that's essentially in a nutshell, that's it. There's some validation that goes on to make sure when you call these new methods, which are opt-in, that you did register the type.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Using dims down here.
Yeah, that's controversial. I guess it's a discussion point. I can explain why I use dims there.
I mean, the first question is, does this have to interoperate with Net Standard?
No.
Is it an interface from .NET Framework? I assume so.
Yes, but yes, it's an interface from .NET Framework.
Have we, Steve, have we split any interfaces from .NET Framework to add dims on them yet?
I mean, we just tried it for the read-only collections, right?
That's true. Okay.
This
is is there difficulty that we haven't taken into consideration?
So the one thing we do know from the testing with the read-only interfaces is that C++ CLI really doesn't like those in some cases. So I don't know whether that's a concern here or not. I know that WinForms has some native dependencies. I don't think they use C++ CLI, but I think WPF does. And WPF, I think, uses those types as well, right?
I believe the C++ CLI issue has been addressed for dims.
Well, not generically, right? Right?
The issue with C++ CLI was not dim related. That is a function of how C++ itself works when presented with two base classes that define the same API. So in C++ today, if you just define a class and you implement both iCollection and iReadOnly collection yourself with no dims, you hit the same issue as we hit in WPF. There's a tiebreaker that C++ CLI ideally adds to help with this scenario, but it's not unique to dims at all. It's just how they handle multiple inheritance, including with interfaces. DIMs just present existing code can now get an ambiguity that they didn't have before, because you're adding new members that could potentially conflict with other members.
Right, but that would probably in this case not happen because they're all net new members, right? They don't exist anywhere else. I mean, the naming is pretty unique.
Well, the consideration is someone could have defined their own interface, public interface, iCustom type descriptor, extra custom, and they could have added this member itself and had a type that inherits from both theirs and this one, and adding this member now conflicts with that one. It's kind of a new
Sure.
APIs can break things in weird ways, even in C#.
Well, I mean, I would say that's a general problem you have with us defining members on existing types, right? They can always conflict with
Right.
user-defined members if they extend our type service. And we generally say we don't care for those because otherwise we can't do anything anymore. I think with interfaces it's a bit more tricky, as you said, because, but I think I would lump this into the same bucket. But I mean, the point still stands, right? Let's say we do this, we approve it, right? You check it in, and then WPF stops building, right? So that would be a, you would have to prevent that from happening. But I guess that's the normal code flow situation we're in.
Yep.
What I missed in the beginning is like, why is DIMS the solution? Because we need to add stuff to an existing interface. We can't define a new interface, or we don't want to.
We can add a new interface. I mentioned that as an alternative. One of the issues that we have right now is we added just the methods that are necessary for WinForms, and it's not clear right now whether we need to continue to add other methods from this interface. So the very last comment says the overloads that take attributes were purposely omitted for now. The comment, the end of the
Right.
comment, the end of custom type descriptor. So I guess if we do add an interface, we would probably either one of two things we would have to do is we would add these other members that we don't care about right now, what might in the future,
Mm-hmm.
or add a third interface in the future, or I guess the other approach, the third approach would be to just not add them. I mean, just keep it as it is right here, and and by the end of the release, if we decide to add 3 or 4 new members, I guess we can do that. And it's kind of internally breaking. So we can certainly add another interface and not use DIMs, but since there's some ambiguity right now about which methods we actually need and which would
Right.
actually be used, it seemed a little fuzzy. Also, this interface is not typically implemented by a general consumer. It's more like a framework code. The application would implement this interface with some base class or some class, and everyone would use that. So it's not commonly used.
Yeah, by then.
Yeah.
I mean, I've used type descriptors heavily before for a project. I don't think I ever touched that interface, but I don't know. Like, I think from my point of view, I mean, putting in another interface is super ugly because it depends on how the interface is being used. But if the interface is passed around, everybody has to do the, try cast this interface to iCustom type descriptor 2, and then, do something meaningful when you can't, right? And it's like, so now you basically split the logic of what the default implementation is pretty much to everybody who has to take it in. So I think the DIM solution is probably the cleaner one. With
There's
fewer
also
moving pieces.
Right, and there's also the case which I had mentioned that we can provide a default implementation, of course, for these methods that can fall back to the existing methods if necessary, and that's not 100% clear yet either, but at least
Right.
it allows us to do that if we need to.
So the only question I have is, how does this interact with VS? So there's design time support for WinForms, which this is part of, right? Is this basically the part of the stack that runs on .NET Core, or is that something that we expect somehow VS to call into?
Do you mean this particular interface or in general?
Yeah,
or-
well, the particular members here, right? So like because VS obviously runs on .NET Framework, right? So they can't really do that. So that's kind of why I'm kind of asking where does this stuff rely stack-wise, I guess.
These are called internally. When you call, for example, methods on type descriptors, saying get properties, it'll say the object that you passed in. There's different overloads, but one of the overloads for get type descriptor.get properties takes object. An object may implement this interface, and then you just forward the call to internally. The call is forward to this.
Right.
Yeah,
But this would
otherwise,
only be.
yeah. Okay.
But this is only for WinForms on core, right? Like it doesn't work for WinForms on desktop, right? And I think then even within VS, I mean, if you design your .NET Core stuff, that will be the part of the stack that runs out of proc in the .NET Core app, right?
Right.
Yeah, I mean.
And I mentioned at the very top here, I didn't talk about it yet, is that we were considering making these new APIs experimental for now, because although we've done a lot of prototyping right now in WinForms using these, we might want to change some things. So I guess that's another high level question is, we may iterate on this. We definitely have some cases that we might add some additional methods. This is our best first shot, gives us about 90%. But we may iterate on this and in that case, maybe we switch to an interface instead of a DIM, for example.
Right.
But this is basically we want to be able to get this in so WinForms can start consuming it more heavily than relying on private branches. But we may iterate on this.
Gonna ask a controversial question. Is the interface even important?
What do you
I'm
mean?
not sure. What do you mean by that?
If this is just we have abstract custom type descriptor and I custom type descriptor and they look the same, do we care about updating the interface, or do we just say if there are no implementations that are not deriving from custom type descriptor, then we could just say the interface is dead, don't use it, just use the class?
No. There are, I custom type descriptor is used quite a bit.
Okay.
But about the nullable, for the nullable bool though, like it seems to be a nod to like people implementing the interface. So the default is going to come from an app context switch. Is that the idea?
We were thinking about adding an app context switch for this, but there's also a requires registered type on that will. Let me take a look here. So okay, which nullable are you looking at? Just to make sure I'm
Sorry,
answering right.
sorry, the nullable bool that is required register types.
Yeah,
like, it just seems odd to me that the dim wouldn't default to false, and then like in custom type descriptor or wherever it matters, just have it default to whatever the app context switch is.
Yeah, so the approach that we have right now in the prototype is that there is a featured switch, and if you set that featured switch, that'll affect what the default is here. I mean, it won't change. It'll still return null, but if null is if it is null, then it'll check to see if that app context switch or featured switch is on, and then it'll have different validation behavior.
Is it important that it's like nullable? Like, what if the dim defaulted to false and then custom type descriptor returned whatever the switch is or the feature switch is? Would that break a scenario?
Basically what happens is that we don't own the implementation of all of these custom type descriptors, and if the default, for example, is false, we don't know if basically the custom type descriptor implementation actually says I don't require registered types, meaning that we don't have to do any validation that the type was registered, or that it just hasn't configured itself, because at some point, WinForms will want to lock everything down and only allow custom type providers that explicitly state whether they know about these known types or not, or whether they care about it. Basically, whether they use reflection or not. And the idea of this is that when we enable that lockdown mode, then we would finally leverage the nullability of this to enforce that. So we would say, hey, you have to return true or false here.
But it seems like you could do that by having the interface return false, having custom type descriptor return like the feature switch for now, and then have it return false later.
Well, we could throw not implemented exception or something like that if the features, if the lockdown mode is on.
So in the future, when you want custom type descriptors that are relying on reflection to just return false from this, right? Or
if you use reflection, they should require true here, because that requires you to register your type, which means that the linker will know that that type that you passed in has the dynamic access members attribute applied to it. If you don't use reflection and you don't do anything weird, then yeah, normally you can just return false. For example, if you're reading properties or attributes or whatever from metadata or from a SQL server or whatever it may be, then you're fine. I mean, you can return false here, but we don't know. That the whole point of this is, kind of do you use reflection or not?
I see. So I had it backwards. So true would be like the safe kind of default if it was not nullable.
Yeah, true would be I use reflection. False would be I don't use reflection, and then the default would be I'm not configured, and you may or may not break. This particular the implementation of this may or may not break, and we don't know. But again, the idea is that we can enforce providers to catch errors early, to validate the app, that sort of thing, by having this nullable and able to detect between the different states.
Okay.
If, however, we had interfaces and not DIMs, that would take care of this. We wouldn't need this.
Because by implementing the new interface, you've already opted into making a choice, basically.
Right. It might make it more difficult for consumers if consumers actually end up calling these methods directly. Normally it's framework code, because then they'll have to switch all the time. They'll have to say, do you implement this interface? Call it. If not, call the old one. So, and I think we kind of covered that earlier. It kind of helps with, providing a default implementation.
So this is true if you require reflection, false if you don't, and null if you don't know. Or rather, you don't even know that there's a method here. Who calls this?
Okay, so if you don't implement true or false, then that means it's an old provider somewhere that no one went back to and updated. You should always return true or false here. It's just that there's a lot of providers, including some of them that might not, be modifiable by, WinForms, for example. But they should be configured to say
who calls it? Who reads it?
The framework will read this when you call when you call these other methods, get converter, get events, get properties. It'll have to validate when you call these to. The framework would typically call these. I don't know how else to answer that, I guess.
Sorry, so is it get properties from registered type is going to ask this property a question? Which you can't enforce because it's virtual. But that it's supposed to?
It would be along the lines of if you called type descriptor.get properties from registered type, and then the provider or the object that you pass in or the provider that we look up then we would have to say, hey, do you support registered types? They called the method to say, I want properties from a registered type. If you're not a registered type, if you're not a, if you return false here or don't implement anything on this particular interface, then we don't know whether you're going to fail or not. If you return false, then we can call the existing method. If you return true, we can call the new method the from registered type. So it basically helps, as you're migrating to these new APIs from registered type, you don't necessarily always know whether the underlying provider uses reflection or not, or you don't know whether they're configured or not.
But I still
to understand.
I don't understand. Still don't understand what the caller is doing and what they do when it's null. And again, these are custom type descriptor get attributes from registered type. This says public virtual, which means you have literally no control over what the implementation does. If you want the implementation to be it calls require registered types and has a behavior, then it needs to be non-virtual and then dispatched to a virtual core method. That is, I've already done the validation and now you need to do the work.
Okay, you're talking about custom type descriptor requires registered types?
I'm talking, all of it, but specifically, let's look at custom type descriptor requires registered types. Like, who invokes the get? What does it mean if it's true? What does it mean if it's false? And what does it mean if it's null? Not who should set true when and who should set false when, but like, what are the implications?
If you require registered types, meaning you return true, the framework will validate that the type that was passed in was registered. So there's validate. It basically means whether or not validation will occur.
So if true, it calls a function to ask, did you call
right
type descriptor.register type?
Yes.
If false, it doesn't check?
It doesn't. Yes, there's no validation at that point.
And if null, it calls the old method?
That depends upon this potential feature switch that we're going to add. But the idea is if you say null, if you call the new method from registered type, and if it returns null, then we have to make a decision. Do we attempt to call the new method or the old method?
But you're
like
in the new method. You don't.
But the provider, but the type descriptor method, the static methods, look up the provider or obtain the object that implements this interface or whatever it may be, and that is not known by the caller necessarily. All of these type descriptor methods are static, right? And there's underlying providers that are registered independently of these methods.
Okay, so it's this method that's going to read the property. The static one's up on type descriptor.
That's the typical way to do it. If someone gets access to these classes, provider classes or interfaces outside of these, then they can also call. But the normal approach is the happy path is that you go through the type descriptor API.
Okay, so it's the type descriptor static methods that you're adding are who require registered types.
Yes.
So not custom type descriptor, the instance get properties from registered type. That is, you called me, I'm going to do it.
Correct. That's the implementation.
So this is the signaler to the wrapper call in the static function.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
That is the part that I was missing.
If I return false from require registered types, would it be acceptable to throw from all these new methods, like from register type? Was the expectation you won't call it since I don't require it? Or
no, it doesn't matter if like I said, the consumer's not necessarily going to know. They don't know today. Okay, so backing up a little bit. type descriptors have providers, and providers return, the properties, events, attributes, that sort of thing, just like reflection does. And there's a built-in provider for reflection that's kind of the default, but people can implement this however they want. If they're getting the properties from SQL Server or whatever. So in general, the consumer, when they're calling get properties, they don't know what provider there is. In fact, there can be more than one provider, and they can be chained, and they could all intermix. And some providers may remove properties and do all kinds of weird stuff. So we have to deal with, some providers being, maybe reflection-based, some providers not being reflection-based, some being, unconfigured and we don't know what they are, that sort of thing. So the idea is to get all of these providers to kind of work together so we can validate. And this main issue isn't necessarily about making apps smaller and whatever, it's to verify correctness. Right now, it's impossible to verify correctness in WinForms when you trim. I mean, you could call get properties and you might get, no properties. There's an example of this down below. I mean, there's an example of, the ambiguity that you get today.
So if I have require registered types, if I'm implementing one of these and I return false, right, which implies that I am, okay, so returning false implies that I'm not doing reflection?
Right. You don't need registered types.
Okay, so, and then would the right thing to do in the false case return like empty collections for like get events and get properties and like a null converter, or are those?
Well, yeah. The built-in provider is going to be reflection, and if any other type of provider has to be configured, through an attribute or at runtime by the application.
I think Stefan's question, and if it's not, it's my question now, is if you return false from required registered types, what should you write for this function? Nothing? Like return null, throw, return call the other guy?
Right. So the default implementation then would be that it just forwards to the existing method. So you don't have to implement those.
So if you say require registered types false, you can do literally no work because
Right.
what you've said is the existing method doesn't use reflection, so it's properly annotated with requires unreferenced
Right.
code, aka I
Right.
didn't require unreferenced code.
If, however, you end up chaining and you call other providers, you may want to implement this so you can do the right thing to pass that on. But in general, yes, the only thing that we would require from an existing provider, which is going to be the majority of them, would be to return false here.
Okay, and then if this was a separate interface, would we still need so the require registered types property we established wouldn't need to be nullable because you could just not implement the interface, but would it be necessary at all? Is it still useful to so you said if you're wrapping other providers it might be useful to return false but do something non-default in the other methods? Yeah,
I mean, if we have a separate interface, people just have to use, C#, the is check everywhere, and if they don't do that, they might not get proper chaining.
Right. I was asking if we did that, and I understand the is check can be annoying, but you would still need this Boolean, right? It wouldn't need to be nullable, or could you get rid of the Boolean too?
Yeah, you could get rid of the bool, as far as I know, because if you don't implement it, the assumption would be that you don't. Well, I see what you're saying, yeah, and I haven't gone down the interface approach yet because I started with DIMS, but yeah, you'd still lack some knowledge about whether or not you understand that you might break if you use reflection. So yes, there would still be an issue. if you you might still need the method. Seems kind of silly, but yeah, it's basically we're trying to get people or all providers to opt into this. Do I use a reflection or not, so we can do proper validation? I mean, that's ultimately a very, simple question or requirement, but it's all around that, and that's the only thing it's for.
And I think Jeremy, maybe I took us off course because I was just trying to understand how it worked better. But I think you were driving at like the virtualness of the property, at least on the abstract class. Like you're thinking that should be like a constructor parameter or something.
I mean, well, when I thought that this method, so on custom type descriptor that get properties from registered type, if the statement was this implementation is supposed to call this property to determine something, then my statement was then it shouldn't be virtual because you can't make all of your derived types do that. But the part where I was mistaken is you don't call the property on yourself. It's the wrapper caller calls you to figure out which of these two methods to dispatch into. Which is, it sort of makes sense, but is also mind warping.
Yeah, it definitely makes you feel like if I need a bool just to see if I can call a method, like why are these methods just not on an interface that I could or could not implement? But
yeah, so you seem to have left methods out.
Yeah, there's some overloads here.
Because like I was looking at, do we already have this garbage where we have an overload of type and object, which is ambiguous?
That's already there.
And then I saw that there are also overloads that take additional parameters that you didn't include here.
Right. There's some that take attributes, which are basically filters, and we don't know if we need those or not for WinForms. Plus, there's other linkability issues with attributes. So that's what I mentioned earlier about maybe being iterative in this area, is that we did not add these because, first of all, we may not need them, I know, for WinForms. Second is that they may not even be linkable in general. We might not be able to figure out, an acceptable path to make that linkable, and we just won't support those.
Okay. I don't know what the rules are for dynamically accessed members. You have a comment that instead of using all, you may narrow it down. I don't know if that's allowed to change after the initial implementation. So, do you know what answer you want?
Yeah, so right now we're basically going to include everything except for private members, because currently that's not used anywhere, at least internally. And which is a thing that happens once in a while, because you do have private methods that, for example, that might have a ruck attribute on them. And then as soon as you use dynamic access members all, those private members that might have a ruck attribute on them, you start getting errors. So we, at a minimum, we're going to remove the private reflection. And we don't expect it to change once we make the final call on that. Otherwise, there's a break and change like you mentioned.
how does it break exactly? Is it just that older compilations might not be respecting the new requirements for trimming?
Any derived method or interface implementation will have to exactly match. In this case, these static methods are not going to be overridden, so you're fine. But if you're calling them from your own method, which then has to be attributed, if you're not suppressing the errors, then you run into this problem. You know, it's basically bubbles up to whatever level people want to suppress that or not. And that's the main reason why, if you look at alternative implementations, is that, hey, maybe we should just remove all of these attributes and figure out some other way to do this. But that was considered too big of a breaking change, especially for providers that we don't own that might be out there. It would be very hard to incrementally support this linkability feature.
So I guess the only question, aside from somebody wanting to say grr and argue that we should do nothing here, is do we like the suffix from registered type and down here to registered type? And do we think that required register types is self-contained enough? So.
And just for a little background, we did call them known types for a while, and then we also, at one point, I think I had reflected types as the term.
Does the default implementation of register type on type description provider throw them?
It figures out what the provider is, and then it tells the provider to register it.
No, but
And
type description provider is abstract. You're having a virtual. Is this virtual going to add to a list? Is it going to throw? Is it going to be no op?
It's up to the provider, and the only case that we have internally that will implement this or override this is going to be the reflection provider. And basically, it is as a to hash table. However, it already needs to do that for caching reasons, so it basically doesn't add any overhead for the reflection provider.
But you described
I
what an
assume the
override's
abstract
going
type's
to do.
going to throw.
Yeah, what's the virtual going to do?
If you call it, it'd be better to throw it than the no op if it isn't overridden, I would assume.
Since the consumer doesn't know, again, what the provider is, the default would have to be no.
What's the default for the base class of the provider?
It should throw, right? Like, it should absolutely throw. Like, if someone thinks that's doing something.
Like,
I was suggesting that it doesn't throw though, but
because in the class type
this is
description
the new-
provider, this is going to have an open curly. What's going after the open curly?
a no op.
And then is registered type returns false by default?
Yes. And require register types returns null.
Why is it so important that it no ops, right? Like, no one's calling type description provider. Like,
because go up to the top. I mean, normally people don't interact with these providers directly unless it's kind of like quote unquote other framework code. People interact with this type descriptor class, and these are all static again. And the first thing it happens when you call one of these methods is it tries to obtain the provider, and then call these other methods, an custom type descriptor or the base class for type providers. And the consumer doesn't care or doesn't necessarily know if the provider supports reflection or not. So they want, if you have a type, this is like WinForm specific in initialized component, they will basically register all the types Normally those are going to be, a lot of reflection provider stuff. So, it'll go to the reflection provider. In some cases, however, it may go to another provider that basically no ops. It says, I don't need to do anything. I don't care about reflection. I don't need to hold on to this type, that sort of thing.
All right, so you just expect there to be code that will be calling register type on an arbitrary type description provider, like just in case it's necessary, but it might not be. So
In case of WinForms, it's pretty much known because, but yeah.
all right, I mean, I guess that makes sense though.
It's auto-generated code in WinForms that will end up calling these top-level methods.
So it's basically that the static register type is just going to say for each provider, go register this type.
Right, and if you know what type of provider is backing that, then you for sure need to call register type. If you know for sure it's not a reflection provider, you don't have to call it. And if you're not sure, well, then you should call it, that sort of thing. But it sounds messy, but I think in most cases, at least for WinForms, that you can just call it, because it doesn't. If your provider doesn't support registered types, it's not going to really add any overhead.
No, that makes sense. I was just wondering, like, if things would necessarily be broken if the registration was ignored, and the answer seems clearly no. Like, things might still work for legacy providers.
From a type system perspective, assuming someone's only supposed to call type descriptor register type, it seems like this is the place that should say, warning, as a general implementation suggestion, this is going to do dynamic member access. Seems like this is the only place that we have to put it. Does the provider actually need the same attribute on the virtual, or would it be up to the implementation types to specify it? I don't know how dynamically access members works on virtuals.
Yeah, so this is kind of honestly a little trick in a way, because even if the reflection provider didn't hold on to this type in a hash table, it doesn't matter, because all of this is just static analysis by the linker. So just by the fact of calling this method, even though it's a no-op, is going to preserve all members, or whatever. Maybe it's not .all, but it's going to preserve whatever properties and fields or whatever we say. And
so it's a feature, not a bug.
It only, okay, so that's one thing. And then the second thing is, if you actually want to validate then later at runtime, several layers deep and, that sort of thing, then you would actually have needed to, store it in a hash table or something like that if you actually want to ensure that your app is going to work correctly once trimmed. So yeah, you only need it in one spot. And this T here, generic parameter T, the linker will see if you, that type and all base classes will get applied. You'll also have to register, any kind of leaf node types that you may want to preserve, that sort of thing.
But I think the question is, like, so the source generator stuff's going to call the static method, right? Which I think everyone agrees should have some sort of dynamic access thing.
Right.
Or maybe not. Wait, but like...
Yeah, the static would make sense.
Okay. But like, yeah, for the abstract class version, if it's really a no-op and the source generator is calling the static method anyway, so things should be preserved, like, why do it twice? What if I'm using this provider type directly and I don't need this?
Right, there's a comment above, you don't have to scroll up, but basically it talks about this, and these methods are called sometimes several layers deep. Providers are just passed around through the base class or through an interface or whatever, and you don't know, WinForms doesn't know, 10 layers deep in a call stack, the type anymore. The type gets lost. It's passed around as type and not a generic parameter, and when you pass a type around as a type and not doing type of on it, basically the linker doesn't know. So you can't have this attribute go 10 levels deep in your call stack. I mean, you can't physically preserve that type all the way down unless you're doing something goofy like type.make generic method and blah blah blah, which of course we don't want to do. So basically, we just do it once at the beginning. The linker does the right thing, and then we don't have to preserve this attribute all the way down. We'll validate it, make sure everything's good, but you're not going to get all of the, necessarily compile time validation that you would normally expect, because it's not desired and not feasible to do that.
Right, but the question is, can we get rid of this attribute?
Right. Like we're not doing reflection on the abstract base class itself, like the type descriptor provider. So presumably if a derived type needs it, it could. And then like the normal trimming, like look at all the possible derived types and preserve the right things, would still happen, right?
Oh, sorry, I misunderstood the question. Yeah, we can get rid of that. I'll have to think about it, but yeah, the linker will see it from the static. If somebody decides to call this public method themselves, maybe it could come in handy. But for now, I think we could remove it.
Right. Well, presumably, in an override, somebody can put the attribute on there. If they wrote it with reflection, they could be correct and say, "Oh yeah, I'm totally going to dynamically access things once you've called this." I mean, they would lose that if they called new here and then instantiate it somewhere else. But it seems like the 99% case is everybody's going to just call type descriptor.register type of t, and then like, good job, you painted it as this type is non-trimmable.
Yeah, no, I think it'd be safe to remove it. I'll go through the existing prototype and usage, make sure no one's newing up these providers and expecting this to work outside of static methods on type descriptor.
So with derived types and dynamically accessed members, is the general rule that like if it's on the base virtual or interface, you have to match it, but if it's not, you can add whatever requirements you want, or are there any rules around that?
I think it has to exactly match. I don't know if it can be a superset or not.
So you're saying it wouldn't be possible in a derived type to add new dynamically accessed members?
I don't know, honestly. I don't. I don't know. I mean, it would take me a minute.
It is.
Yeah. It makes sense that you could add additional ones, assuming everything's additive, right, and not subtractive or something. But yeah, it's all additive today, so I think it would make sense that it'd be some kind of bitwise comparison or something, and then as long as you match the base class, you're good.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure the answer. That was the question. Yeah.
And looking over the shape, I don't understand property descriptor dot converter from registered type.
What is different about that from the other ones?
Yeah, that's one. That's one of my questions.
No, I mean it follows the same pattern. That's what I meant. There's a ruck attribute on it, and
well, but I understand at a provider level the difference between get type descriptor from registered type and get type descriptor. I mean, sort of. I definitely understand at the highest level of type descriptor, the statics. I understand the difference. I don't understand what property descriptor converter from registered type is, because you're now asking a question. So I don't understand who calls versus doesn't call this question.
Right. Okay. So it's taking okay, just from the signature point, it's following the same pattern. It's a property in this case, not a method, and it's adding from registered type on it. And it just basically means that if you're not registered type and you require registered types, then it will throw, because the converter is typically, for example, on an attribute on a class, or configured at runtime. So Is it okay, Jeremy? I'm not sure. Are you saying that because this is a property or not a method?
I don't.
following.
I don't understand who's going to call it. I don't understand how it behaves differently from converter, other than you got rid of the requires used on reference code. How does it get set in a way that somebody can actually call it? Like, to me, this line does not. Other than it uses the same convention
okay.
naming, it doesn't
Yes.
match the rest of the proposal. So I don't
Okay.
understand anything about it. So please explain.
Okay. So the existing converter method, because it has ruck on it, right? Ruck is super bad. You basically don't know what it does, right? You can't call it. I mean, you can't trim it. You can't safely trim it. It's completely broken. We can't remove this attribute. So we added converter from registered type that says now we have a new method, and you call that when you registered your type, and then then we can remove that ruck attribute. I believe that the deal with the converter is it assumes there's some methods that you might have implemented on the converter, and those methods need to be preserved. I mean, we can't trim them out.
So is it like literally everyone who calls converter should now call what's basically just converter 2? I got rid of the ruck attribute.
If you need to get the converter from the property descriptor, yes.
So this is, again, just literally everyone should call it. It has nothing to do with if a provider had a required registered type set to true, false, or null. It's like this is for all intents and purposes. You're saying this is now obsolete. Call get converter 2 instead.
Yes.
Except that the default implementation of this has to be to go call the other property.
Well, not necessarily, but
Okay, how are you going to implement it?
well, you could validate that
No.
the type that.
That you're again, I think you're describing what an override would do. I'm asking what's the virtual going to do.
Oh, okay. So I mean, we can't make it abstract, right? Because that's going to break everyone.
Sure.
So the default would end up calling the existing method.
And suppressing the you can't require unreferenced code from a non-requires unreferenced code context.
Say that again. I didn't follow.
Well, you're going to get a warning that you don't have requires unreferenced
Oh, yeah,
code,
yeah,
but
we
you're
would
calling a thing that
suppress-
says requires
yeah.
unreferenced code. So it's going to suppress the warning and call the existing thing.
Right. Yeah, this is not pretty,
And then and then some other override type is going to maybe do something different than that, but that this is dead. Should we mark this as obsolete?
I don't know. I mean, we did talk about going through and validating or quote unquote removing some of these existing methods if you have a feature switch on. That feature switch would basically say, require registration of types, and then we would throw an exception if you call the existing method. We're still debating, or we haven't gotten that far, I should say. The best course of action there, but that has been a discussion that by having this feature switch, we might start throwing in some of these other methods because they're and the behavior might slightly change too in these new methods. We might not support all of the same scenarios as the existing method.
Okay, I mean that'll break any type provider that was built using net standard, but maybe you don't care. But my point is just if literally everyone should stop calling this property and should start calling this other property, then that to me sounds like the first one should be marked as obsolete. I also don't know that it needs to say from registered type because I don't think it has to do with type registration. You're just saying you need to write it without requires unreferenced code.
So I think that's a good point. We could actually apply that obsolete attribute, I guess, to other methods as well then.
The only one I've heard that you can do it to is this one. Unless you want to do it on all the statics on type descriptor.
We could. I mean, to force people to upgrade to the new APIs, but in theory, if you're not supporting trimming, and if you don't care about trimming, there's nothing wrong with calling the existing method. If you don't have your, if you're not WinForms and you don't plan on doing any kind of trimming, the existing method is fine.
Okay.
Yeah, like I said, this is not pretty. But with these attributes, there's just not a way to, short of rewriting and providing new APIs or writing a source generator. Those are really the only two APIs, the only two alternatives. I mean, to this. It's not unlike SystemText JSON, which has different serialized and deserialized methods. Some with the D are ruck on and some without. And if you care about trimming, you use the source generator, and then you call a different method that you pass in the JSON type context, whatever. It's in a way it's a similar pattern that we add another overload or a new method and remove the attribute on the new one.
Fair enough. I mean, at this point, I'm probably just voting lunchtime. But does anybody have anything they want to change from? At this point, the only thing we've modified is we got rid of the dynamically accessed members off of the instance one on provider.
Yeah, I was about to say I have to drop. By the way, I did a little more looking up stuff. I haven't tried it, but it looks like it has to match if you're going to put the dynamically accessed members on like an override. Anyway.
Fair enough. Which might mean that it makes sense to leave it there, but if you're not reflection based, it's a lie. So who knows?
It feels wrong to just assume that it's necessary, and yeah, the static one should take care of it.
Right, because the static one, there's kind of no choice. It either hides it from you and defeats the purpose, or it says it always does it, which may be overzealous. But all right. I think it has some confusing aspects, but we'll see how it works out, I guess. Sounds to me like a unanimous vote for lunchtime.
Okay, thank you. And like I said, this is going to be iterative, so this will probably come back with some additional APIs, and then if anything happens, with the new APIs that we're adding here, of course, we can revisit at that point. We'll know more at that point.
Alrighty.
Quick question. I think we didn't get to the assembly one and the Swift one, right? So the only two ones we had left, right?
Those are the only two off of your pre-guest agenda, yeah.
Yeah. Booyah, do you have a sense for how important this one is? Like, does this have to be done soon?
I don't really know. But I don't know who put blocking.
Yeah, the reason I'm asking is because I think the next time, so let me look at the schedule here really quick. The next time is Tuesday, we have reserved for ML.NET's tokenizer design. And then next Thursday, which is a week from now, basically, we would have another open slot, I think. Unless I'm missing something that I don't think I do. So I would schedule the set assembly, the Swift, and the... Actually, never mind. There's also the tensor and supporting types, which I also have to schedule. So this one probably... No, this one we looked at already, right?
No, we got through in index and in range and decided the name
That's
will
right.
be TensorSpan, but we didn't look at the body of TensorSpan.
So that means there's still, yeah, probably a solid 2 hours left. So I probably have to book this one for next Thursday. So that means, practically speaking, it would take a week and a half to get to the other ones. I hope that's okay. If not, let me know. And then we can probably do some unnatural gymnastics in between.
I was going to say we lost quorum here, so I don't know that there's anything other than schedule some other meeting.
No, I mean more like, you know, if Booyah has reservations, then we could do something over email or something. Otherwise, it's going to be a week and a half from now.
Yep.
I'm just trying to figure out the schedule. I'm not trying to make decisions.
Yeah, fair enough.
All right, so then I set up next Tuesday. Yeah, next Tuesday, and then next Thursday.
Looks like our series is ending next week. Might want to extend it.
Yeah, the week after there's also this one also ended. That's true. Fun times. All right.
Alrighty. Well, stats are on a different page now. So thanks everyone for joining us. I know it was a little slow today, but probably still important. Yeah, we'll see you next time. So Tuesday, 10 a.m. Redmond time here, same .NET time on our same .NET channel. Auf Wiedersehen.